Rachel Morrison is 33 years old, and her life is a symphony of controlled chaos. She operates in the high-stakes theater of a metropolitan emergency room, where the air is thick with the scent of antiseptic and the persistent hum of cardiac monitors. Rachel isn't just a nurse. She is a tactical responder, a woman who spends 12-hour night shifts managing the thin, vibrating line between life and death with a clinical, battle-hardened precision. While the rest of the world sleeps, Rachel is the one keeping her hands steady during a crisis. A woman of immense resilience who single-handedly saved $45,000 from her grueling shifts to build a guest house on her property. She believed she was building a future of stability for her family, unaware she was actually funding a fortress for her own undoing. But the moment Rachel pulls into her gravel driveway at 7:30 a.m., her professional power evaporates. She walks past the 600-square-foot cottage where her mother-in-law, Patricia, has lived rent-free for 5 years, a stay that was promised to be 6 months, tops, but has since turned into a permanent occupation of Rachel's peace. The air in her own home feels heavy, saturated with a toxic, low-level radiation of judgment that begins the moment she crosses the threshold. Rachel enters her kitchen to find the cabinets rearranged and a pointed, handwritten note left on the counter by Patricia. The note is a jagged little pill, criticizing the disordered state of the home and claiming that 6-year-old Emma deserves a cleaner environment than the one Rachel provides. Despite being the primary engine of the family's finances, Rachel is treated like an incompetent intruder by a woman who hasn't paid a utility bill or a cent of rent in half a decade. The emotional exhaustion of the night shift, the trauma of the ER, and the physical toll of staying awake while the sun rises clashes violently with the suffocating paranoia of being watched. Her husband, David, is no shield. He dismisses the mounting tension as Patricia simply being old-fashioned, pleading with Rachel to ignore the constant, calculated undermining. David tells her to not engage, effectively asking Rachel to disappear within her own walls. Rachel is a woman who can handle a mass casualty event without blinking, yet she feels increasingly hunted and small in the very house she bought and paid for. As the morning sun finally hits the kitchen window at a sharp, revealing angle, Rachel freezes, her coffee mug halfway to her lips. There, on the outside of the glass, are oily, unmistakable smudges. It wasn't a bird, a smudge of dirt, or the morning dew. It was the distinct, blurred print of a human face and hands pressed firmly against the pane. Someone had been standing in the shadows of the flower beds in the dead of night, cupping their hands to the glass to peer inside, while Rachel was away at the hospital saving lives. This wasn't just a meddling mother-in-law anymore. This was the chilling realization that Rachel was under 24-hour surveillance by a spy living in her own backyard, documenting her life like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The discovery of those oily prints on the window pane didn't just chill Rachel, it galvanized her. She didn't scream, and she didn't wake David. Instead, she retreated to the one place in the house Patricia hadn't yet managed to colonize, the small mahogany desk tucked into the corner of the master bedroom. It was 8:00 a.m., the hour when her body usually begged for the heavy curtains to be drawn, but the adrenaline of being watched was more potent than any caffeine. Rachel opened her laptop, her eyes, burning from a 12-hour shift of monitoring vitals, now fixated on a different kind of life support system, her family's bank statements. The timeline of their life together felt like a slow-motion car crash viewed in reverse. Rachel and David had married at 26, a time of optimism and shared goals. Then came the request that changed everything. Patricia, at 58, was struggling after her divorce and had nowhere to go. David had looked at Rachel with those pleading eyes, promising it would be 6 months, tops, until his mother got back on her feet. Rachel, believing in the sanctity of family, had agreed. She didn't just offer a guest room. She liquidated $45,000 of her own nursing savings, money earned through thousands of grueling hours in the ER, to build a 600-square-foot sanctuary for a woman she barely knew. But as the digital pages scrolled, the temporary narrative collapsed. Those 6 months had bled into 5 long years. Patricia had contributed $0 to the construction, 0 to the rent, and 0 to the utilities that ran on the main house meter. Rachel's mind drifted to the guest house. The separate entrance, the full kitchen, the bathroom, all of it built with her sweat equity. And yet, Patricia's gratitude remained non-existent. In fact, the more Rachel provided, the more Patricia criticized, frequently telling neighbors that poor Emma was neglected because her mother chose to sleep all day after her night shifts. The numbers on the screen began to tell a story far more sinister than mere ingratitude. Rachel began to cross-reference their $145,000 combined income against their suspiciously low savings. They should have been comfortable, prosperous, even, but they were perpetually living paycheck to paycheck. She remembered the conversation from year 4, when she had confronted David about the missing $800 a month they should have had extra after paying off the construction loan. He had been evasive then, muttering that life is expensive. He had eventually confessed to sending his mother $500 a month for dignity, and Rachel, too exhausted to fight, had relented. But as she dug deeper into the hidden submenus of their joint account, Rachel realized she had been fed a lie. David wasn't just sending pocket money. He had been a master of manipulation, transferring funds from savings to checking to obscure the trail. The $500 had been a smokescreen. The reality was a tiered escalation. $800 a month in year 2, jumping to $1,500 in year 4, and peaking at a staggering $2,000 every single month for the past year. Rachel felt the air leave her lungs as the grand total materialized. $72,000 in monthly transfers. And that didn't even account for the loans. The $3,200 for car repairs, the $8,000 for credit card debt, even $4,200 for a roof repair on the very guest house Rachel already owned. The total amount David had siphoned into his mother's pocket, while Rachel was saving lives at 3:00 a.m., was $92,900. She sat in the silence of the bedroom, the weight of nearly $100,000 in betrayal pressing against her chest. David was still asleep, his breathing rhythmic and untroubled, completely unaware that his wife had just found the financial smoking gun. Rachel realized then that the oily prints on her window weren't just the marks of a curious mother-in-law. They were the marks of a woman who was protecting her investment. Patricia wasn't just living on their property, she was harvesting it. The financial betrayal was a cold, hard number, but the emotional war for Rachel's daughter was becoming a living nightmare. As Rachel closed her laptop, her mind raced through the past 3 years of Patricia's creeping influence. What started as helping out had evolved into a calculated psychological rebrand. Patricia didn't just want a place to live, she wanted a legacy, and she had chosen 6-year-old Emma as her primary target. It began subtly during the 3rd year of Patricia's temporary stay. Patricia started taking Emma for outings, without asking, later claiming she was the grandmother and didn't need permission to be with her own blood. When Rachel chose a Montessori preschool to foster Emma's independence, Patricia had scoffed, calling it too permissive, and whispering to the child that her mother didn't know how to raise a proper lady. But the true chilling moment came when Patricia began correcting Emma's speech, teaching the toddler to call her Mama Pat. Rachel had objected immediately, her voice trembling with a mix of exhaustion and maternal instinct. She had turned to David, expecting him to defend the sanctity of her title as a mother. Instead, David had offered his usual spine-shattering shrug. "What's the harm?" he'd asked, his voice filled with the complacency of a man who had already been bought and paid for. "She's just a lonely grandmother who loves her." By year 4, the seeds Patricia planted had begun to bloom into thorns. Rachel would come home from a 36-hour weekend rotation, her body aching and her mind frayed, only to have Emma pull away from her embrace. The child's eyes, once full of unconditional adoration, now held a flickering shadow of doubt. "Mama Pat says you love work more than me," Emma had whispered one afternoon while they were coloring. "She says I can live with her in the little house when I'm bigger, and we can play all day while you're gone." Every night shift Rachel worked was now a weapon Patricia used against her. While Rachel was in the ER, Patricia was in the main house, eroding the foundation of Emma's trust. She fed the girl's anxieties, telling her that real mothers don't leave their children at night and that David was incompetent for letting it happen. As Rachel sat in the quiet of her bedroom, the morning sun fully illuminating the room, she heard the front door creak open downstairs. It was Patricia, using her own key to enter without knocking, as she had done every day for years. Rachel heard Emma's joyous shout, "Mama Pat," followed by Patricia's honeyed, manipulative response, "I'm here, sweetie. Since your mommy is still sleeping, let's go see what Mama Pat has for you." Rachel felt a surge of adrenaline that far surpassed the fatigue of the night shift. She stood up, her jaw set, realizing that the $92,900 was just the price David had paid to let his mother kidnap their daughter's affection. She walked toward the stairs, ready to reclaim her house and her child, but she stopped when she heard Patricia's voice drop to a conspiratorial whisper. "Don't worry, Emma," Patricia said softly. "Soon, we won't have to wait for her to wake up at all. We're going to have a much better home just for us." The honeyed whispers from the kitchen downstairs acted like an electric shock to Rachel's system. She didn't just feel the fatigue of her night shift anymore. She felt the cold, hard clarity that comes when a mother realizes her child is being groomed for a life without her. Rachel stood at the top of the stairs, her pulse thrumming in her ears, watching through the banister as Patricia moved through the kitchen with a proprietary air, tossing out a half-eaten breakfast David had prepared for Emma, and replacing it with a healthier, organic bowl she had brought from the guest house. It was a performance of domestic perfection designed to highlight Rachel's perceived absence. For the next few hours, Rachel tried to reclaim a sense of normalcy. She walked downstairs, reclaimed her daughter with a firm "Good morning, Emma," and ignored Patricia's theatrical sigh of "oh," so the mother finally wakes. She spent the morning doing laundry and clearing the breakfast dishes, the very dishes Patricia had earlier deemed a sign of a neglected home. But the domestic peace was a fragile glass shell, and it shattered at exactly 2:00 p.m. The doorbell didn't just ring, it sounded like an alarm. When Rachel opened the door, she wasn't greeted by a neighbor or a delivery driver. Two stern-faced women in professional attire stood on her porch, their badges identifying them as investigators from Child Protective Services. "Mrs. Morrison," the first worker asked, her voice devoid of warmth. "We're here regarding a report of child neglect." The air left the hallway. Rachel, a woman who had seen the most horrific trauma the ER could offer, felt her knees go weak. "What? Neglect? I'm a nurse. My daughter is 6 years old and perfectly healthy." The workers entered the house with a practiced, intrusive efficiency. They checked the fridge, looked for locks on the bedroom doors, and began their inspection. One worker pulled out a file and showed Rachel a series of photographs that turned her blood to ice. There were shots of the sink full of dishes, toys scattered on the rug, and most damningly, time-stamped photos of Rachel's car leaving the driveway at 11:00 p.m. while Emma was in bed. "The report claims you are frequently absent at night. leaving the child in an unsanitary environment with an incompetent caregiver, the worker stated, her eyes scanning the very kitchen Rachel had just cleaned. It suggests that the child would be better placed temporarily with a stable, local relative who is present 24/7. Rachel's mind flashed back to the oily smudges on the window she had found earlier that morning. The surveillance wasn't just a grandmother's curiosity. It was a curated evidence log. "Who filed this?" Rachel asked, her voice a low, dangerous vibration. The investigator checked her clipboard. "The report was filed by Patricia Morrison, your mother-in-law." Rachel looked out the kitchen window toward the guest house she had paid $45,000 to build. Patricia was standing on the porch of the cottage, arms crossed, watching the main house with a look of predatory expectation. She wasn't just trying to win a psychological war anymore. She was using the state to facilitate a legal kidnapping. The front door had barely clicked shut behind the CPS investigators before Rachel was moving. The shock hadn't paralyzed her. It had sharpened her into the same surgical instrument she became when a trauma code was called over the hospital intercom. She didn't confront Patricia, who was still hovering like a vulture on the guest house porch, and she didn't call David. She knew that if she spoke to David now, his frantic excuses would only cloud the battlefield. Instead, she grabbed the spare set of keys she kept hidden in the kitchen junk drawer. The keys to the very house she had paid to build. Walking across the yard felt like crossing a DMZ. Every step on the grass she paid to have mowed felt like a violation of her own soul. She unlocked the door to the guest house with a steady hand, stepping into the space that her $45,000 had created. The air inside was thick with the scent of Patricia's heavy lavender perfume and a stifling, artificial order. It was a museum of Rachel's stolen life. She bypassed the living room and went straight for the small mahogany desk in the corner, a desk Rachel had bought for her own daughter's future, now repurposed as Patricia's command center. In the bottom drawer, tucked behind a stack of Grandparenting Today magazines, Rachel found it. A thick, expanding accordion folder labeled simply Emma's Future. As Rachel flipped it open, the breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just a few photos. It was a curated, professional-grade dossier of her perceived failures. There were logs, written in Patricia's cramped, precise cursive, detailing every time Rachel had arrived home late from a shift. There were printed-out screenshots of Rachel's social media posts where she had joked about needing a glass of wine after a 12-hour shift, now highlighted in yellow with the word alcoholism scribbled in the margins. But the most gut-wrenching discovery was a subfolder titled The Physical Evidence. It contained dozens of photos taken through the kitchen window, the very window where Rachel had found the face smudges that morning. The photos showed Emma eating cereal in her pajamas while David scrolled on his phone, captioned, "Father distracted, mother absent." Another showed a pile of laundry on the sofa, unsanitary living conditions. Rachel realized with a sickening jolt that while she was at the hospital holding the hands of dying strangers, the woman living 10 feet away was documenting the dust on her baseboards to use as a weapon in court. Patricia hadn't just been living there. She had been building a case for grandparents, rights, and emergency custody, intending to use Rachel's own career as the primary evidence of her unfitness. Rachel's eyes blurred with tears of rage as she found the final document, a drafted legal petition already signed by a local family law attorney. It wasn't just a threat. The wheels were already turning. She clutched the folder to her chest, the $92,900 betrayal by David now paling in comparison to this. Her husband had funded the very woman who was currently trying to steal their child's mother away. She heard the gravel crunch outside. Patricia was coming back. Rachel didn't run. She stood in the center of the room, the folder in her hand, waiting for the woman who had turned her sanctuary into a sniper's nest. The confrontation in the guest house was brief but blistering. When Patricia walked in and found Rachel holding the Emma's Future folder, she didn't apologize. She didn't even look ashamed. She simply tightened her lips and said, "A mother who cares would have been home to prevent those photos from being taken." Rachel hadn't responded. She had simply walked past her, folder clutched to her chest, and drove straight to the office of Lisa Vance, a family law attorney known for being a shark in high-conflict divorces. Now, sitting in Lisa's sterile, glass-walled office, the clinical calm of the ER was the only thing keeping Rachel from collapsing. Lisa didn't look like an investigator, but she moved with the same surgical efficiency Rachel used when debriding a wound. On the desk between them lay a mountain of bank records, the digital ghosts of Rachel's missing life savings. "Rachel, I've finished the forensic audit of your joint accounts," Lisa said, her voice dropping into a tone that usually preceded a terminal diagnosis. "It's worse than the $500 pocket money David admitted to. Much worse." Rachel watched as Lisa laid out a spreadsheet. It was a roadmap of a 5-year betrayal. The $45,000 Rachel had spent on the guest house construction was just the entry fee. The audit showed a steady, monthly hemorrhage that had accelerated every year. In the first year, David had funneled $800 a month to Patricia. By the third year, it was $1,200. But the last 12 months were the true killing blow. David had been transferring $2,000 every single month from their primary checking account into a private account in Patricia's name. "He wasn't just helping her buy groceries, Rachel," Lisa explained, pointing to a highlighted section. "He was funding her entire lifestyle while she lived 10 feet away from you for free. He paid her credit card bills, her car insurance, and even her consultation fees for the attorney who drafted that custody petition against you." The room felt like it was spinning. "She used my money to pay for a lawyer to take my daughter." Rachel's voice was a ragged whisper. "Technically, it was marital funds. But since you are the primary breadwinner, yes. You essentially funded your own character assassination," Lisa said. She flipped to the final page of the audit. Between the monthly transfers, the emergency loans, and the undisclosed debts David took on to cover his mother's lifestyle, the total dissipation of marital assets is exactly $92,900. Rachel looked at the number. It represented thousands of hours of standing on her feet in the ER, hundreds of missed bedtimes with Emma, and 5 years of sheer physical exhaustion. Every time she had stayed for a double shift to get ahead, David had been siphoning the surplus into the guest house. "There's one more thing," Lisa added, sliding a final document across the table. "While David was telling you he couldn't afford a family vacation last summer, he took out a personal loan for $15,000. The collateral was the guest house itself. The money was transferred to Patricia 48 hours later." Rachel leaned back, the silence of the office ringing in her ears. The $92,900 wasn't just a financial loss. It was the price tag of David's true loyalty. He hadn't been a partner. He had been a double agent, working for the woman who was currently trying to dismantle Rachel's life piece by piece. "What do we do now?" Rachel asked, her eyes hardening into the cold, professional gaze she used when a patient was beyond saving. Lisa smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "Now, we stop playing defense. We serve the eviction, we file for divorce, and we show the court exactly how your husband spent nearly $100,000 of your hard-earned money to help his mother stalk you." The drive home from Lisa's office was the quietest 30 minutes of Rachel's life. The folder containing the $92,900 paper trail sat on the passenger seat like a live grenade. She didn't feel the usual tremor of exhaustion that followed a double shift. She felt a cold, crystalline focus. She was no longer a wife or a daughter-in-law. She was a woman triaging a dying relationship, cutting away the rot to save herself and Emma. When she walked through the front door, the house was staged for a domestic performance. Patricia was on the sofa, reading a storybook to Emma with an exaggerated, saintly patience. David was in the kitchen, nursing a beer, his shoulders hunched in the posture of a man who hoped that if he stayed quiet enough, the world would stop demanding things of him. "Emma, baby, go upstairs and pack a bag for a sleepover at Aunt Sarah's," Rachel said, her voice level and devoid of emotion. "But we're in the middle of a story," Patricia interjected, her eyes flicking to the thick folder in Rachel's hand. "And Sarah is so loud. It's not a good environment for a school night." "Now, Emma," Rachel repeated. The girl, sensing the atmospheric pressure change, scrambled upstairs without a word. David stepped into the living room, sensing the shift. "Ratch, what's going on? You look different. Did the CPS people leave?" "The CPS people left because they finished their initial sweep," Rachel said, walking to the center of the room. She didn't sit. She stood, forcing them to look up at her. "But they'll be back, because someone told them I was an unfit mother. Someone took photos through my windows at night while I was saving lives. Someone decided that because I work, I don't deserve my child." David looked at his mother, then at Rachel. "Ratch, Mom was just worried. She saw things. She saw what she wanted to see so she could steal my daughter, David," Rachel snapped, the first crack of fire appearing in her voice. She threw the folder onto the coffee table. It fanned out, spilling the bank statements and the surveillance logs across the mahogany surface. "And she did it using my money." David's face went from pale to ghostly. He looked down at the highlighted transfers, the $2,000 monthly payments, the $15,000 secret loan, the $92,900 total that Rachel had spent 5 years earning. "I was helping her, Rachel. She's my mother," David cried, the desperation in his voice echoing through the house. "She was struggling. I couldn't just let her drown." "You didn't help her, David. You subsidized a predator," Rachel said, her gaze shifting to Patricia, who remained eerily calm. "You took nearly $100,000 from our daughter's future and handed it to a woman who used that very money to hire a lawyer to take Emma away from us. You paid for the knife she's sticking in my back." Patricia finally stood, smoothing her skirt. "I did what was necessary for the child. You're never here, Rachel. You're cold. You're clinical. This house needs a heart, and David knows I'm the only one who provides it." "The only thing you provide is a bill," Rachel countered. She reached into her pocket and pulled out 2 sets of papers. She handed the first to Patricia. "This is an unconditional eviction notice. You have 30 days to vacate the guest house. If you step foot in this main house again before then, I'm filing a restraining order based on the surveillance evidence I found in your desk." Then she turned to David, handing him the second set of papers. "And these are divorce papers. Since you've already spent your half of our assets on your mother's lifestyle, I'll be keeping the house. You can go help her pack." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of David's beer bottle hitting the floor, the liquid seeping into the rug like the years of trust he had let wash away. The glass shattered in the kitchen, but Rachel didn't flinch. She had spent a decade watching trauma patients bleed out. A spilled beer and a broken marriage weren't going to make her pulse jump. David stood frozen, staring at the divorce papers as if they were written in a language he didn't understand. Behind him, Patricia had retreated to the shadows of the hallway, her saintly mask finally slipping to reveal a panicked, calculating look. "Rachel, wait," David stammered, stepping over the glass. You're overreacting. The money. I can explain the money. My mom had debts. Old debts you didn't know about. I was just trying to keep us from being embarrassed by her mistakes. It was a family matter. A family matter. Rachel's voice was like a scalpel, thin, sharp, and precise. I am your family, David. Emma is your family. That woman in the hallway is a guest who overstayed her welcome by 4.5 years and used your kindness to fund a war against your wife. There is no explanation for $92,900 that doesn't involve you choosing her over us every single month for 60 months straight. David reached for her hand, but Rachel stepped back, her clinical armor impenetrable. I'll do anything, he pleaded. I'll get the money back. I'll make her leave. I'll tell the CPS workers it was all a misunderstanding. Please, Ratch, don't throw away 7 years of marriage over a rough patch. This isn't a rough patch, David. This is a forensic audit of your soul, Rachel said. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the same weakness that had allowed Patricia to move in 5 years ago. He wasn't a villain, he was something worse. He was a coward who had paved the way for a villain. She pointed to the clock on the wall. It's 6:00 p.m. I'm going to Sarah's house to stay with Emma tonight. I'm giving you exactly 12 hours to make a choice, though I think we both know you've already made it. You can either stay here, call the police to report your mother for the unauthorized surveillance and harassment she's committed, and sign a full confession regarding the dissipation of our marital assets. Or you can be gone when I get back. You want me to call the police on my own mother? David's voice went up an octave, a note of pure disbelief. She called the state on me, David. She tried to take our daughter. Rachel's composure finally broke, a roar of maternal fury echoing through the house. She stood in our flower beds and peered through our windows like a criminal. She treated our home like a stakeout. If you can't see the crime in that, then you're part of the conspiracy. Patricia's voice drifted from the hallway, cold and thin. He won't do it, Rachel. He knows I only did it out of love. He knows you're the one who tore this family apart with your career and your ambition. Rachel ignored her, keeping her eyes locked on David. 12 hours, David. If you're still here and she's still in that guest house without a police report filed, I'm calling Lisa Vance and we are going for blood. I will take this house. I will take the retirement accounts to balance out the $92,000 you stole, and I will ensure you never see Emma without a court-appointed supervisor again. She didn't wait for his answer. She grabbed her keys and walked out the door, the sound of her heels on the hardwood marking the final seconds of the life they had built. As she pulled out of the driveway, she looked in the rear-view mirror. David was standing in the window, but he wasn't looking at her. He was looking toward the guest house, where Patricia's light was already flickering on. The 12-hour ultimatum expired in the sterile, gray light of the following morning. Rachel hadn't slept. She had spent the night at Sarah S., watching the rhythmic rise and fall of Emma's chest, wondering how many of the child's dreams had been tainted by Patricia's whispers. When she pulled back into her driveway at 7:00 a.m., the absence of David's car was the first thing she noticed. A flicker of hope, thin and fragile, brushed against her heart. Perhaps he had finally chosen to be a man. Perhaps he was at the police station. But the hope died the moment she stepped into the kitchen. The broken glass had been swept up, but on the counter sat a legal pad with David's handwriting. I can't do it, Ratch. She's my mother. I've taken her to a hotel to get her away from your threats. We need to talk like adults once you've calmed down. I'm taking Emma for her scheduled park day this afternoon. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Rachel felt a cold, jagged laugh climb up her throat. He was still trying to manage her, still trying to mediate between a predator and her prey. She didn't call him. She didn't text. Instead, she called Lisa Vance and the local precinct. By 2:00 p.m., Rachel was sitting in her car a block away from the community park, her hands gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles were white. Through the trees, she saw David's car. She saw him lead Emma toward the swings. And then she saw the silver sedan pull up right behind him. Patricia stepped out, dressed in a floral Sunday coat, looking every bit the doting grandmother. Rachel watched through the lens of her phone as David greeted his mother with a hug. There was no hesitation, no police report, no boundaries. He had lied about the hotel, or perhaps the hotel was just another base of operations. He was allowing the woman who had filed a CPS report against his wife to sit on a park bench and play with the child she was trying to legally kidnap. Rachel stepped out of her car, the forbidden proximity incident unfolding in real time. As she approached the playground, the air seemed to hum with the impending collision. Emma saw her first, her face lighting up before flickering into a mask of confusion. "Mommy, you're not at work." David spun around, his face draining of color. "Rachel, wait, it's not what it looks like. She just wanted to say goodbye. She's leaving, I promise." "She was never supposed to be within 100 yards of my daughter, David," Rachel said, her voice carrying across the quiet playground, drawing the eyes of other parents. She held up her phone, which was still recording. "I gave you 12 hours to choose. You chose to facilitate a meeting with a woman who is currently under investigation for harassment and filing a false state report." Patricia stood up, her eyes narrowing into slits. "You're making a scene, Rachel. You're proving exactly what I told the investigators. You're unstable." "No, Patricia," Rachel said, stepping closer until she was inches from the woman's face. "I'm a nurse. I know exactly how to handle a terminal situation. And this is the moment of death for this family." She turned to David, who was stammering, caught in the middle of a lie he could no longer sustain. "I told you what would happen if you chose her. You didn't just break a rule, David. You broke the last string holding us together." Rachel took Emma's hand. The child was crying now, sensing the finality in her mother's tone. "We're leaving," Rachel said. "Rachel, don't do this," David shouted, reaching for her arm. "Don't touch me," she hissed, her voice a low, vibrating warning. "The next person who speaks to you will be my attorney, and the next person who speaks to your mother will be a process server." As she walked Emma toward the car, Rachel didn't look back at the man standing between his mother and his wife. She realized with a bitter clarity that David wasn't a man caught in a hard place. He was a willing participant in his own life's destruction. The park betrayal wasn't just a secret meeting. It was the final piece of evidence Rachel needed to ensure David Morrison would never have unsupervised access to their daughter again. The final blow didn't happen in the trauma bay or on a playground. It happened in the quiet, wood-paneled silence of a courtroom. Rachel sat at the petitioner's table, her posture as straight as a spinal needle. Across the aisle, David looked diminished, his expensive suit hanging off a frame that seemed to have withered without Rachel's strength to prop it up. Behind him, Patricia sat in the gallery, her face a mask of indignant martyrdom, still clutching a handkerchief as if she were the victim of a great tragedy. Lisa Vance stood and laid the final piece of evidence on the judge's bench. It was the documentation of the secret $15,000 loan David had taken out, using the guest house, Rachel's guest house, as collateral. "Your Honor," Lisa's voice rang out, "the respondent didn't just dissipate marital assets. He encumbered the petitioner's sole property to fund a woman who was actively working to dismantle this family. This wasn't a mistake. It was a 5-year financial execution." The judge didn't need long to deliberate. The verdict was a clinical excision of the rot. Because of the clear pattern of financial dissipation and the documented harassment, via the CPS report, the court awarded Rachel the house and the entirety of the retirement accounts to balance the $92,900 debt. David was ordered to assume the $15,000 loan himself. But the true justice came in the custody ruling. Rachel was granted primary custody, with David's visitation strictly supervised due to his demonstrated inability to protect the child from a documented harasser. The day the movers took the last of David's things was the day the demolition crew arrived. Rachel stood on her back porch, Emma's hand in hers, watching as the yellow claw of an excavator tore into the roof of the guest house. She didn't want the rental income. She didn't want the extra space. She wanted the physical manifestation of those 5 years of exploitation turned into splinters and dust. As the walls collapsed, Rachel felt a physical weight lift from her chest. A 5-year-old breath she was finally allowed to exhale. 2 years later, Rachel's life had been entirely rebuilt. She was now a charge nurse, earning a salary that stayed in her own accounts. Her new home was smaller, humbler, and lacked a guest house, but every square inch of it was a sanctuary. Peace had become her new baseline. She slept through the night now, the silence no longer feeling like a threat. One rainy Tuesday, a letter arrived with no return address. Inside was a note from David. He spoke of his regret, of how Patricia had moved into a senior apartment 90 miles away and was now draining his sister's bank account. He begged for a family dinner for Emma's sake, promising he had finally seen the light. Rachel read the letter twice, then fed it into the shredder. He had had 5 years of Tuesdays to choose his wife and daughter. The silence she gave him now was the only thing he had earned. As she tucked Emma into bed that night, the house felt warm and secure. But as she walked past the hallway mirror, she caught her own reflection and paused. She was happy, yes. She was safe. But she realized that when she looked at people now, new friends, potential partners, she no longer saw just their smiles. She saw the shadows behind them. She found herself checking the windows twice before bed, a habit she couldn't seem to break. She had won the war, but she wondered if the woman she used to be, the one who gave $45,000 away because she believed in the goodness of family, was buried somewhere under the rubble of that guest house. And as she glanced at her phone, she saw a notification. A friend request from a name she didn't recognize, but whose profile picture was taken from the end of her new driveway. The war was over, but in the quiet of the night, Rachel realized that some watchers never truly leave the shadows.